In the grand theater of human interaction, where most scramble for attention through noise and bluster, there exists a profound truth that the ancients understood but modernity has largely forgotten. True power emanates not from the mouth that speaks loudest, but from the mind that chooses when to remain silent. This is the Machiavellian principle of stillness, a weapon so subtle yet devastating that its wielder commands respect not through force or eloquence, but through the sheer gravitational pull of controlled presence. The concept is deceptively simple, yet its mastery requires the complete annihilation of one's weaker impulses. For in a world where everyone seeks to be heard, the individual who has learned the art of strategic silence becomes a magnetic force, drawing others into their orbit through nothing more than disciplined restraint. This is not the silence of the meek or the withdrawn, but the calculated quietude of those who understand that words, once spoken, can never be retrieved, while silence preserves infinite possibilities. Consider the boardroom where deals worth millions hang in the balance. While lesser minds rush to fill every pause with justifications, explanations, and desperate attempts at persuasion, the individual who has mastered stillness sits unmoved, allowing the weight of silence to do what 1,000 words cannot. In these moments, respect is not earned through verbal prowess but commanded through the demonstration of absolute self-control. The message is clear: this person needs nothing from you, desires nothing from you, and therefore holds all the power in the exchange. This phenomenon extends far beyond business negotiations into every realm of human interaction. In personal relationships, the individual who refuses to engage in emotional theatrics while others spiral into drama becomes the stable center around which chaos revolves. They become the sought-after confidant, the respected advisor, the one whose opinion carries weight precisely because it is given sparingly. Their silence becomes a form of currency, more valuable for its rarity than any verbal coin could ever be. The destruction of the weak self begins with the recognition that most human communication stems from insecurity, fear, and the desperate need for validation. We speak to fill uncomfortable voids, to prove our worth, to demonstrate our intelligence, or to seek approval from others. These impulses, natural though they may be, represent the weak self in all its vulnerable glory. The individual who seeks to command respect through stillness must first identify and systematically eliminate these compulsions. This process requires brutal self-honesty. One must examine every urge to speak and ask, am I speaking because I have something valuable to contribute, or because I cannot tolerate the discomfort of silence? Am I offering genuine insight, or am I merely performing my intelligence for an audience? Am I responding to the situation, or reacting to my own emotional turbulence? The weak self speaks impulsively, defensively, and excessively. The transformed self speaks only when silence would serve less effectively than words. The transformation is neither quick nor comfortable. In a culture that equates volume with value and mistakes activity for achievement, the path of stillness feels counterintuitive, even dangerous. There will be moments when silence feels like surrender, when the urge to justify, explain, or defend becomes nearly overwhelming. These are the crucible moments where the weak self either dies or survives to sabotage future growth. The individual committed to this path must learn to sit with discomfort, to allow others to misinterpret their silence, and to trust that their restrained presence will ultimately speak more eloquently than any verbal defense. The Machiavellian aspect of this approach lies not in manipulation for its own sake, but in the strategic understanding of human psychology. People are drawn to what they cannot easily obtain or understand. The individual who speaks constantly becomes predictable, their thoughts transparent, their motivations obvious. But the person who chooses their words carefully creates an aura of mystery and depth that others find irresistible. This is not about being deliberately cryptic or withholding, but about understanding that some of your power lies in what you choose not to reveal. In professional environments, this translates into becoming the person others seek out rather than the one who seeks out others. When you speak only when you have something genuinely valuable to contribute, your words carry exponentially more weight. Colleagues begin to pay attention when you do choose to speak, knowing that your input will be considered and worthwhile. You become known not for your ability to fill meeting time with talk, but for your capacity to cut through noise with precision. The weak self seeks constant reassurance, explanation, and validation. It cannot tolerate being misunderstood and will exhaust itself trying to control how others perceive it.
The transformed self understands that others' opinions, while sometimes relevant, are not the foundation upon which self-worth is built.
This liberation from the need for universal approval creates an unshakable foundation that others instinctively recognize and respect. This inner work manifests externally in subtle but powerful ways. Body language becomes more controlled and purposeful. Fidgeting decreases as inner restlessness is tamed. Eye contact becomes steadier as the need to seek approval diminishes. Posture improves as internal confidence solidifies. These changes occur naturally as the inner transformation takes place, requiring no conscious performance because they emerge from genuine internal shifts. The power of stillness extends into conflict resolution with remarkable effectiveness. While others escalate through increasingly heated exchanges, the individual who has mastered this principle remains unmoved by attempts to provoke reaction. Their calm presence often deflates aggressive behavior more effectively than any counterargument could. They become the adults in rooms full of emotional children, garnering respect not through victory in verbal combat but through demonstration of superior emotional regulation. This approach requires distinguishing between productive silence and passive withdrawal. Productive silence is active and engaged. The individual is fully present, listening intently, processing information, and choosing their moments of engagement with precision.
Passive withdrawal, by contrast, is disengagement born of fear, insecurity, or social anxiety.
The former commands respect, the latter invites dismissal. The practice develops gradually through conscious effort in daily interactions. Begin by introducing deliberate pauses before responding to questions or challenges. Notice the impulse to fill every silence and resist it. Observe how others react to your increased stillness. Some may initially interpret it as disengagement or lack of interest, but those worth impressing will recognize the shift in your presence. In social situations, resist the urge to compete for conversational dominance. Instead, become the person who listens with full attention, who asks thoughtful questions, and who speaks only when adding genuine value. This shift often results in others seeking your perspective precisely because you don't force it upon them. Your opinion becomes valuable through scarcity rather than abundance.
The weak self fears silence because it fears being forgotten, overlooked, or deemed unimportant.
It operates from scarcity, believing that opportunities for recognition are limited and must be seized through constant self-promotion. The transformed self operates from abundance, understanding that true influence comes not from demanding attention but from earning it through consistent demonstration of judgment and self-control. This principle applies powerfully in leadership contexts. The leader who feels compelled to comment on every decision, to have the last word in every discussion, and to constantly assert their authority actually diminishes their influence through overexposure. The leader who speaks when their words will have maximum impact, who asks questions more often than giving answers, and who demonstrates confidence through restraint rather than assertion commands deeper respect and loyalty. The journey requires developing comfort with being misunderstood or underestimated. There will be times when your silence is interpreted as agreement when you disagree, as ignorance when you are informed, or as weakness when you are simply choosing your battles wisely.
The weak self cannot tolerate these misperceptions and will rush to correct them.
The transformed self understands that these misinterpretations often work to their advantage, allowing others to underestimate them while they observe and gather information. This practice fundamentally alters your relationship with time and patience. The weak self operates with urgency born of insecurity, feeling that every moment not spent asserting itself is a moment of lost opportunity. The transformed self operates with the patience of someone who understands that influence is built over time through consistency rather than intensity. They can afford to wait because they are playing a longer game with higher stakes. The elimination of weak patterns extends beyond verbal restraint into emotional regulation. The individual who cannot control their emotional reactions cannot truly control their words, and therefore cannot access the full power of strategic silence. This means developing the capacity to remain centered regardless of external provocations, to maintain composure in the face of criticism or praise, and to respond rather than react to challenging situations. Physical stillness often accompanies and reinforces mental stillness. The person who cannot sit comfortably without fidgeting, checking their phone, or engaging in nervous behaviors broadcasts their inner restlessness to everyone around them. developing the capacity to be physically still, to sit with hands relaxed, posture upright but not rigid, and attention fully present becomes a powerful nonverbal communication tool.
This transformation affects personal relationships profoundly.
Friends and family members begin to seek your counsel precisely because you don't offer it unsolicited. Your willingness to listen without immediately jumping to advice or judgment creates safe spaces for others to process their thoughts and emotions.
Your relationships deepen because people feel truly heard rather than merely talked to.
The practice requires developing acute awareness of your motivations for speaking. Most conversation is driven by ego, the need to appear intelligent, informed, interesting, or important. When you speak from these motivations, your words serve your ego rather than the conversation or the people involved. Learning to recognize these impulses and choosing silence instead gradually shifts your communication from ego-driven to value-driven. This awareness extends to understanding the rhythm and flow of conversations. Just as musicians understand the power of rests and pauses in creating beautiful music, masterful communicators understand that silence creates space for others to fill, often revealing far more than direct questioning would. Your strategic pauses become invitations for others to share more deeply, to clarify their positions, or to expose their true motivations. The business world particularly rewards this approach when properly executed. In negotiations, the ability to sit comfortably with silence after making an offer or asking a question often compels the other party to reveal their position or make concessions they hadn't intended. In meetings, being the person who speaks only when you have something substantive to contribute elevates your status and makes others pay attention when you do choose to engage.
However, this power must be wielded with wisdom rather than manipulation.
The goal is not to gain unfair advantage over others but to optimize your interactions for mutual benefit. When your reduced verbal output is matched with increased quality of contribution, everyone benefits. Your silence creates space for others to contribute, your questions demonstrate genuine interest in their perspectives, and your occasional insights carry more weight because they emerge from careful consideration rather than impulsive reaction. The transformation process involves recognizing and dismantling the social conditioning that equates speaking with participating, volume with authority, and constant communication with engagement. These equations, while deeply embedded in modern culture, often work against genuine influence and respect. The individual who can resist these cultural pressures and operate according to different principles gains access to forms of power that others cannot even recognize, much less counter.
Physical presence becomes increasingly important as verbal presence decreases.
How you occupy space, how you move, how you position yourself in relation to others, these elements gain prominence when words are used sparingly. The individual who has learned to command attention through presence rather than speech develops a different relationship with their physical being, understanding it as an extension of their mental and emotional state. The elimination of weak patterns often reveals how much energy was previously wasted on unnecessary verbal output. The mental resources formerly devoted to constant commentary, explanation, and social positioning become available for deeper observation, analysis, and strategic thinking. This shift enhances actual competence and judgment, creating a positive feedback loop where increased capability supports the confidence needed to speak less and listen more. Relationships with others begin to operate on different terms as your transformation deepens. People stop expecting constant feedback, commentary, or validation from you, and start appreciating the quality of attention you provide when you are engaged. Your presence becomes more valued precisely because it cannot be taken for granted. Others begin to modify their own behavior around you, often becoming more thoughtful and less impulsive in their communication.
The practice reveals how much of normal social interaction consists of nervous energy discharge rather than meaningful communication. Observing others' compulsive speaking patterns while maintaining your own disciplined restraint provides insight into human psychology that would otherwise remain hidden. This understanding enhances your ability to influence and lead while reducing the energy you expend on social maintenance. Professional advancement often accelerates as colleagues and superiors begin to associate you with depth, judgment, and reliability rather than mere enthusiasm or agreeability. Your reputation shifts from someone who can be counted on to provide an opinion to someone whose opinion is worth seeking. This distinction, subtle though it may seem, fundamentally alters how others interact with you and the opportunities they present to you.
The internal work required for this transformation serves broader purposes beyond social dynamics. Developing the capacity to sit with discomfort, to resist impulses, and to maintain inner stillness regardless of external circumstances builds psychological resilience that proves valuable across all areas of life. The discipline required to master strategic silence strengthens the same mental muscles needed for achieving long-term goals in any domain. As the weak self continues to dissolve, what emerges is not coldness or withdrawal but a more authentic and powerful form of engagement. Your words, when you choose to use them, carry the weight of genuine consideration. Your silence communicates presence and attention rather than absence or disinterest. Your overall interaction style becomes more intentional and, therefore, more effective in achieving your actual objectives rather than simply satisfying immediate emotional impulses. The second phase of this transformation involves understanding that true invulnerability comes not from avoiding destruction but from making oneself undestroyed through the systematic elimination of destructible elements within. Most individuals carry within them seeds of their own downfall, weaknesses that others can exploit, insecurities that can be triggered, emotional patterns that can be manipulated. The person who has undertaken the conscious destruction of these vulnerable aspects achieves a form of psychological invincibility that no external force can breach. This process begins with the uncomfortable recognition that your greatest enemies are not external but internal. The voices of self-doubt, the patterns of reactive behavior, the need for others' approval, the fear of judgment, these internal weaknesses create vulnerabilities that others can and will exploit. Traditional approaches to building confidence or resilience often focus on strengthening these weak areas, but this approach seeks their complete elimination instead. Consider how most people can be easily manipulated through their insecurities. Show them disrespect, and they react with anger or defensiveness. Question their competence, and they scramble to prove themselves. Threaten their social status, and they become anxious and accommodating. Each of these reactions provides leverage for others to control their behavior. The individual who has eliminated these reactive patterns removes the handles by which others might manipulate them. This elimination process requires developing a relationship with yourself based on truth rather than comfort. Most internal weaknesses persist because they serve some psychological function: protection from pain, avoidance of responsibility, maintenance of familiar patterns even when they prove destructive. Destroying these patterns means accepting the discomfort they were designed to avoid and finding more effective ways to meet legitimate psychological needs. The work begins with radical honesty about your current vulnerabilities. What comments or behaviors from others trigger strong emotional reactions in you? What criticism cuts deepest? What fears keep you awake at night? These emotional tender spots represent areas where others can wound you, control you, or predict your responses. Rather than protecting these vulnerabilities, the path of transformation involves deliberately exposing them to examination and gradually building immunity through understanding and practice. This process differs fundamentally from suppression or denial. Suppressed emotions and ignored insecurities maintain their power precisely because they remain unconscious and unaddressed. The approach here involves bringing these patterns into full conscious awareness, understanding their origins and functions, and then systematically choosing different responses until new patterns become automatic. Take, for example, the common vulnerability of needing others' approval. Most people remain slaves to this need throughout their lives, modifying their behavior, opinions, and even their personalities to maintain others' good opinion. This need creates a profound weakness because it makes your internal state dependent on external factors beyond your control. Others quickly learn to use approval and disapproval as tools to shape your behavior according to their preferences rather than your own best interests. The destruction of this pattern requires developing an internal validation system that operates independently of others' opinions. This means learning to evaluate your actions, decisions, and characteristics according to your own standards rather than seeking confirmation from others. The process is challenging because it requires taking full responsibility for your choices and their consequences without the comfort of shared responsibility that comes from seeking others' approval first. As this particular weakness dies, something remarkable occurs: others' attempts to manipulate you through approval or disapproval lose their effectiveness entirely. Praise no longer inflates your ego, and criticism no longer deflates it. Both become simply information to consider rather than emotional triggers that control your internal state. This immunity makes you far more dangerous to those who rely on emotional manipulation as their primary tool of influence. The same principle applies to other common vulnerabilities. Fear of failure keeps many people trapped in comfortable mediocrity because the emotional pain of potential failure feels unbearable. By deliberately exposing yourself to small failures and learning to process them without emotional devastation, you build immunity to this fear. Eventually, the possibility of failure becomes simply another factor to consider in decision-making rather than a paralyzing constraint on action.
Fear of judgment operates similarly.
Most people modify their behavior extensively to avoid others' negative judgment, often sacrificing their own goals and values in the process. The individual who has learned to be genuinely indifferent to others' judgment, not through arrogance or defiance, but through deep inner security, gains tremendous freedom of action. They can pursue their objectives without the drag of constant social calculation and adjustment.
This transformation requires distinguishing between legitimate concern for others' perspectives and neurotic need for their approval.
Wise individuals certainly consider how their actions affect others and take feedback seriously when it serves their growth. The difference lies in the emotional charge attached to others' opinions and the degree to which these opinions determine your choices. The process often involves deliberately triggering your own vulnerabilities in controlled circumstances to study your reactions and practice different responses.
If criticism typically sends you into defensive spirals, you might seek out feedback specifically to practice receiving it with equanimity.
If social rejection triggers anxiety and people-pleasing behaviors, you might deliberately risk small rejections to build tolerance for this discomfort. This work requires developing a different relationship with pain and discomfort. The weak self seeks to avoid all emotional pain and will sacrifice long-term well-being for short-term comfort. The transformed self understands that some discomfort is necessary for growth and actively chooses challenges that promote strength over comfort that promotes stagnation.
Physical practices often support this psychological transformation.
Regular exposure to controlled physical discomfort through exercise, cold exposure, fasting, or other disciplinary practices builds general tolerance for discomfort while demonstrating your capacity to choose difficult paths when they serve your development. These practices also create concrete evidence of your ability to overcome impulses and maintain discipline, which strengthens confidence in your capacity for psychological transformation. The relationship with anger requires particular attention in this process.
Anger often serves as a protective mechanism for underlying vulnerabilities, hurt, fear, or insecurity.
People who can easily anger you hold power over your emotional state and can manipulate your behavior by triggering these reactions. Learning to observe anger arising without immediately expressing it or acting on it removes this vulnerability while preserving your capacity for appropriate assertiveness when the situation genuinely calls for it.
Similarly, the need to be right represents another common vulnerability that others can exploit.
People who cannot tolerate being wrong or admitting mistakes can be easily manipulated by those who understand this weakness. Creating situations where you must admit error or acknowledge others' superior knowledge gradually builds immunity to this particular form of ego-driven behavior. The transformation affects your relationship with material possessions and status symbols. Much of what people consider identity-threatening actually involves threats to their image or status rather than to their genuine well-being. The individual who has separated their sense of self from external markers of success becomes far more difficult to threaten or control through material leverage. This process reveals how much psychological energy is typically spent maintaining and defending a false self constructed from others' expectations, social conditioning, and unconscious patterns. As these artificial structures dissolve, the energy formerly devoted to their maintenance becomes available for genuine pursuits and authentic relationships. The work often accelerates through deliberate engagement with people and situations that would previously have triggered your defensive patterns. Rather than avoiding challenging personalities or difficult circumstances, you begin seeking them out as opportunities to test and strengthen your growing invulnerability. Each successful navigation of a previously triggering situation provides evidence of your transformation and builds confidence for handling even greater challenges.
Professional environments provide excellent laboratories for this development.
difficult colleagues, unreasonable demands, public criticism, and high-pressure situations all offer opportunities to practice maintaining your center regardless of external circumstances. As your reactivity decreases, others begin treating you with increased respect, often unconsciously recognizing that their usual manipulation tactics prove ineffective with you. Personal relationships undergo significant shifts as your transformation deepens. Friends and family members who previously could control your behavior through emotional manipulation find their tactics no longer work. Some relationships improve as they shift to more authentic foundations, while others may deteriorate if they were primarily based on dysfunctional patterns. This sorting process, while sometimes painful, ultimately creates space for healthier connections. The practice requires developing sophisticated self-awareness to distinguish between genuine emotional responses that deserve attention and conditioned reactions that serve no useful purpose. Learning to pause between stimulus and response allows you to choose your reactions consciously rather than being driven by automatic patterns. This pause develops through meditation, reflection, and conscious practice in daily interactions. Initially, you may only recognize your patterns after reacting automatically, but gradually your awareness speeds up until you can observe the impulse to react without immediately acting on it. This space between impulse and action becomes the foundation of your freedom. As vulnerable aspects continue to dissolve, what emerges is not emotional numbness but emotional authenticity. Instead of reactive emotions based on wounded patterns, your emotional life becomes more aligned with your actual values and objectives. You feel anger when situations genuinely warrant it rather than when your ego feels threatened. You experience joy based on authentic satisfaction rather than temporary relief from insecurity. This emotional authenticity creates a different kind of presence that others find compelling. People are drawn to individuals who seem genuinely unflappable not because they lack emotions but because their emotions serve them rather than controlling them. This quality communicates strength and reliability that proves attractive in both personal and professional contexts. The process eventually reaches a point where external circumstances lose their power to destabilize your internal state. Criticism, praise, success, failure, acceptance, rejection all become experiences you can navigate without losing your center. This is not indifference or detachment but rather a deep-rootedness that allows you to engage fully with life while maintaining your psychological equilibrium. This state proves remarkably practical in addition to its philosophical appeal. Decision-making becomes clearer when emotional reactions no longer cloud your judgment. Relationships improve when you can interact from strength rather than need. Professional performance increases when you can focus on objectives rather than managing emotional states. Leadership capacity expands when others recognize your stability and trustworthiness. The individual who has successfully destroyed their weak self discovers a profound paradox: in losing the parts of themselves they thought they needed to protect, they become truly protected. In releasing the aspects of personality they feared losing, they become impossible to diminish. In accepting the possibility of destruction, they achieve a form of invulnerability that no external force can breach. The final dimension of this transformation reveals the ultimate Machiavellian truth, that the greatest strategic advantage comes not from acquiring new powers but from eliminating the weaknesses that make power necessary in the first place. The individual who needs nothing from others cannot be controlled by anyone. The person who fears nothing external cannot be threatened into compliance. This state represents the apex of personal sovereignty, a condition where influence flows naturally from inner authority rather than external manipulation. This culmination phase requires understanding that most human suffering and vulnerability stem from attachment to things beyond your direct control. People suffer when others reject them, when circumstances don't meet their expectations, when their plans fail, or when their status diminishes. Each of these sources of suffering represents a point of leverage that others can use against you. The systematic elimination of these attachments creates a condition of inner freedom that translates into practical invulnerability. The process begins with distinguishing between preferences and attachments. Having preferences about outcomes is natural and useful, it guides decision-making and motivates action. Attachment to specific outcomes, however, creates psychological dependency that others can exploit. The individual who must have a particular result will compromise their principles, sacrifice their values, or submit to manipulation to achieve it. The person who prefers certain outcomes but remains psychologically free regardless of what occurs cannot be controlled through threats to those outcomes.
This distinction proves crucial in professional contexts.
The employee who desperately needs their job becomes vulnerable to exploitation and poor treatment because their employer understands their dependency. The entrepreneur who cannot tolerate the possibility of business failure makes conservative decisions that limit their potential and may paradoxically increase their likelihood of failure. Conversely, the individual who pursues success enthusiastically while remaining psychologically free from the need for specific outcomes can take appropriate risks and maintain their integrity regardless of results. The same principle applies to social relationships.
The person who needs others' approval, affection, or presence becomes vulnerable to emotional manipulation and unhealthy relationship dynamics.
Others learn to use the threat of withdrawal, emotional, social, or physical, as tools for control. The individual who values relationships while remaining fundamentally complete without them creates healthier relationship dynamics because others cannot use dependency as leverage for manipulation. This transformation requires developing a different relationship with desire itself. Rather than being driven by desires or suppressing them, you learn to observe desires with detachment while choosing which ones to pursue based on wisdom rather than compulsion. This shift moves you from being a slave to your wants to being their conscious director. The practice involves deliberately exposing yourself to situations where you cannot have what you want or where you lose what you value. Rather than avoiding these experiences, you use them as opportunities to practice maintaining equanimity regardless of circumstances. Each successful navigation of unwanted outcomes builds resilience and reduces your overall vulnerability to life's inevitable changes and losses. This approach extends to your relationship with your own reputation and image. Most people invest tremendous energy in managing how others perceive them, creating elaborate personal brands and carefully curated public presentations. This investment creates vulnerability because any threat to your image becomes a threat to your psychological well-being. Others can control your behavior by threatening to expose embarrassing information, spread damaging rumors, or publicly criticize your performance. The individual who has achieved true inner authority maintains appropriate care for their reputation while remaining psychologically free from others' opinions. They understand that reputation serves practical purposes in professional and social contexts, but they don't derive their sense of self-worth from external validation. This freedom allows them to act with integrity even when doing so might damage their image, because their inner sense of worth remains intact regardless of others' judgments. This state requires developing an internal compass that operates independently of social pressure. Most people navigate by constantly checking others' reactions and adjusting their behavior accordingly. This external orientation makes them predictable and controllable. The individual with strong internal guidance can remain consistent in their values and choices even when everyone around them disagrees or disapproves.
The financial dimension deserves particular attention in this context.
Money represents security, status, and options for most people, making financial threats powerful tools of control. The individual who cannot imagine life without certain financial resources becomes vulnerable to exploitation by anyone who can threaten those resources. This vulnerability often keeps people trapped in unsatisfying jobs, unhealthy relationships, or compromising situations because the alternative seems financially impossible. Achieving financial inner freedom doesn't require wealth. Many wealthy individuals remain psychologically enslaved by their attachment to maintaining or increasing their resources. Instead, it requires developing confidence in your ability to create value and meet your needs regardless of your current financial situation. This confidence comes from understanding your own capabilities, maintaining simple living standards when necessary, and cultivating skills that remain valuable across various circumstances. The process involves deliberately practicing living with less to build confidence that you can maintain your well-being even if your financial situation changes dramatically. This practice might include periods of voluntary simplicity, learning practical skills that reduce dependency on services you must purchase, or developing multiple income streams that reduce reliance on any single source of financial security. Physical health and aging present another area where attachments create vulnerability. People who cannot accept the possibility of illness, disability, or death remain psychologically vulnerable to any threats to their physical condition. This vulnerability often leads to excessive anxiety about health issues, poor decisions based on fear rather than wisdom, and exploitation by those who understand these fears. Developing a healthy relationship with your physical mortality doesn't mean becoming careless with your health or welcoming suffering. Rather, it means accepting the inherent uncertainty and impermanence of physical existence while taking reasonable care of your body without being psychologically enslaved by health concerns. This acceptance reduces anxiety and improves decision-making by eliminating the distortions that fear creates in risk assessment. The political and social dimensions of this transformation prove increasingly relevant in contemporary society. Many people's psychological well-being depends heavily on having their political views validated, their social groups maintained, or their cultural values respected by the broader society. These dependencies create vulnerabilities that political actors and social movements can exploit through various forms of pressure and manipulation. The individual who has achieved true inner authority maintains their values and participates in political and social life while remaining psychologically independent of outcomes beyond their direct control. They can advocate for their principles without needing others to agree, participate in social groups without needing constant validation, and engage with cultural changes without feeling threatened by perspectives different from their own. This independence proves particularly powerful in an era of increasing social polarization and political manipulation. Rather than being triggered into reactive responses by various forms of propaganda and social pressure, the psychologically independent individual can evaluate information objectively and respond thoughtfully rather than emotionally. The intellectual dimension requires similar attention. Many people derive their sense of worth from being right, appearing intelligent, or maintaining certain beliefs about reality. These attachments create vulnerabilities when new information challenges their worldview or when others question their intellectual competence. The need to be right often prevents learning and growth while creating leverage for those who understand these intellectual insecurities. Developing intellectual humility while maintaining confidence in your analytical abilities represents a crucial balance. This means remaining open to new information and willing to change your mind when evidence warrants it, while also trusting your capacity for sound reasoning and good judgment. The individual who can admit error without feeling diminished and change positions without feeling defeated becomes far more difficult to manipulate through intellectual challenges. The creative and expressive dimensions offer additional areas for potential vulnerability and liberation. Many people remain psychologically dependent on others' appreciation of their creative output, making them vulnerable to criticism and rejection that can stifle their creative expression. The artist, writer, or innovator who needs positive reception for their work often compromises their authentic expression to meet others' expectations. Achieving creative freedom means pursuing authentic expression while remaining psychologically independent of others' responses. This doesn't mean ignoring feedback or failing to consider your audience, but rather creating from genuine inspiration rather than from need for validation. This freedom often results in more powerful and original work because it emerges from authentic sources rather than calculated appeals for approval. The spiritual dimension, regardless of specific religious or philosophical orientation, presents perhaps the deepest opportunity for either vulnerability or freedom. Many people's psychological stability depends on maintaining certain beliefs about meaning, purpose, or ultimate reality. Threats to these beliefs, whether through intellectual challenges, traumatic experiences, or social pressure, can create profound distress and make individuals vulnerable to manipulation by those who claim to offer certainty or comfort. Developing spiritual maturity means finding peace and purpose that can withstand uncertainty about ultimate questions. This might involve embracing mystery rather than demanding absolute answers, finding meaning in the process of living rather than in guaranteed outcomes, or developing practices that provide inner stability regardless of external circumstances. This state of inner freedom creates what might be called practical invulnerability, not because you cannot be harmed or because you have no preferences about outcomes, but because others cannot use threats to things you value as tools to control your behavior. When someone cannot predict what will motivate you to act against your principles or abandon your objectives, they cannot effectively manipulate you. The transformation culminates in a paradoxical relationship with power itself. Traditional approaches to gaining power focus on acquiring resources, building influence, or developing advantages over others. This approach reveals that the ultimate power lies in needing none of these things. When you require nothing from others, they naturally seek what you might offer them.
When you fear no loss, others cannot threaten you into compliance. When you need no validation, your approval becomes valuable to those who seek it. This condition creates natural leadership opportunities because others recognize your stability and authenticity. People gravitate toward those who seem genuinely centered and independent, often seeking guidance or partnership precisely because they sense your freedom from the insecurities and dependencies that drive most human behavior. The practical applications prove remarkably broad. In negotiations, your willingness to walk away without distress gives you enormous leverage. In relationships, your emotional independence allows you to love freely rather than from need. In career situations, your willingness to lose any particular position enables you to maintain your integrity and pursue opportunities aligned with your values rather than your fears. The state also affects your relationship with time and patience. When outcomes matter less than processes, you can afford to take longer-term perspectives and make decisions based on wisdom rather than urgency. This temporal freedom often leads to better results because it allows for more thoughtful planning and execution. As this transformation reaches completion, you discover that the very qualities others might attempt to attack or diminish, your reputation, resources, relationships, or status, become irrelevant to your core sense of well-being. This doesn't mean you become careless with these things, but rather that your psychological stability no longer depends on them. Others quickly recognize this independence and begin treating you with increased respect, often unconsciously acknowledging your invulnerability to their usual forms of social pressure. The final realization comes when you understand that this inner freedom, achieved through destroying the weak self that needed protection, provides the greatest possible protection. You become like water, which cannot be destroyed because it has no fixed form to break. Your strength comes not from rigidity that might shatter under pressure, but from fluidity that adapts to circumstances while maintaining its essential nature. In this state, respect flows naturally not because you demand it or manipulate others into providing it, but because others recognize your authentic strength and independence. Your silence commands attention because it emerges from choice rather than fear. Your words carry weight because they come from consideration rather than compulsion. Your presence creates stability because others sense your inner peace and freedom. This represents the ultimate Machiavellian achievement, gaining power not through acquisition or manipulation, but through the systematic elimination of everything that could make you powerless. In destroying the weak self that could be destroyed by others, you become truly indestructible not because you cannot be harmed, but because nothing others can do to you can diminish the essential core of who you have become. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has removed everything destructible within himself, leaving only what is eternal, authentic, and unassailable. In this condition, respect is not earned or commanded but naturally granted, and power is not seized or defended but freely expressed through the simple fact of your uncompromising presence in the world.